Did anyone catch it? Because it's for the second week in a row, we have Jesus telling those people, his disciples, those people who have left everything behind and devoted their lives to following him. These people think that something great and good is coming about and that they're in the middle of all of this amazing and good work. And for the second week in a row, Jesus turns to them and says that I'm going to suffer and die. Seems kind of like a Debbie Downer, right? At least on first glance. But there's some really great news in this text as well. What's been weird for me is that ever since I read our text for this week, I read them on Mondays, and then I read other materials about them throughout the week before we write the message, is that after I read Psalm 1 and this Mark text, I've had this one song stuck in my head all week. I found myself singing it nonstop, and it's not a very long song, so it gets a bit annoying. And it took several days of me singing this tune over and over again before I realized the connection, and so you know how well I sing. We're still going to sing together. If you know it, please sing along, okay? I've got the joy, 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 joy down in my heart. Down in my heart. Down in my heart. I've got the joy, 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 joy down in my heart. Where? Down in my heart to stay. And I'm so happy, so very happy. I've got the love of Jesus in my heart, and I'm so happy, so very happy. I've got the love of Jesus in my heart. Wow, at least 5 of you were happy. But what's weird about this song is I was wondering, why this song? Why would this song surface in my mind after reading and reflecting on this text? Not just surface, but linger. Why joy, 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 joy down in my heart? And I believe it's because there's a calling to joy that we often bury and overlook in this story. In our first psalm, Psalm 1, the psalm we just heard today, we are told, "Happy are those who do not follow the advice of the wicked or take the path that sinners tread or sit in the seat of scoffers, but their delight is in the law of the Lord, and on his law they meditate day and night." Happy are those whose delight is in the law of the Lord. What makes you happy? When the Browns win? I'll be honest, I was celebrating Thursday night. I mean, come on. What makes you happy? When the sun shines. Grandchildren, children. Family. Okay, I'll tell you something that makes me very happy. That doesn't happen very often. In Tara's family, her parents had a code where they would talk about BC, and it was before children. We're going to talk about that, right? Children are wonderful, and we're going to talk about kids again because it's in our gospel text. But before kids, my mornings were amazing. I could just get up and get a cup of coffee and watch the news unbothered. It doesn't happen very often. Every now and then our kids will stay the night at their grandparents' house, our parents' house, and I'll have a morning like that. Something that makes me happy is just that time and that quiet. But this text tells us that there's something more. All the things we listed off were great, but there's even something more, some kind of joy that we can find, happiness that we can find that's greater than that. We find happiness, we find joy in God and by following God's will. So the obvious question becomes, what is God's will? Or as the psalmist writes it, the law of the Lord. So what is the law of the Lord? And we get an answer in our Mark passage. We'll read it again, that Mark passage. It says, "They went on from there and passed through Galilee. He did not want anyone to know it, for he was teaching his disciples, saying to them," this is that Debbie Downer, right? "The Son of Man is to be betrayed into human hands, and they will kill him, and 3 days after being killed, he will rise again." But they did not understand what he was saying and were afraid to ask him. Then they came to Capernaum, and when he was in the house, he asked them, "What were you arguing about on the way?" But they were silent. For on the way they had argued with one another who was the greatest. And he sat down, called the 12, and said to them, "Whoever wants to be first must be last of all and servant of all." Then he took a child and put it among them, and taking it into his arms, he said to them, "Whoever welcomes one such child in my name welcomes me. And whoever welcomes me welcomes not me, but the one who sent me." We're entering into several weeks of passages from the lectionary that are going to follow a very similar pattern. And the pattern is this, and it's actually not unique, it's throughout the Gospels. The pattern is this: Jesus will say something, and then his disciples won't understand. Jesus will say that the Son of Man will be handed over to suffer and die, and then we'll hear that the disciples do not understand. Jesus will say, "Let the children come unto me," and the disciples will say, "No." We're going to get this over and over again. Jesus will say something and the disciples do not understand. And in literary terms, this is something called foreshadowing. Because it's foreshadowing that we will do the same thing. That we will hear Jesus call to us, but we just won't understand. That God calls for us to love one another and to celebrate the joy in following Christ. You know what we're going to do? We're going to bicker over who does it best, right? Oh yeah, I packed those bags better than any of you guys on Thursday night. My bags were perfect, right? Jesus is going to call us to find joy in service, and you know what we're going to do? We're going to say, "I like that other song better." Right? We should have sang this different one because it's better. Or God's going to call us into service, and we're going to say, "I can't do that. That's too hard. I can't go and sort, or I can't go and love, or I can't go and sit with somebody in the hospital. It's too hard. It's much easier for me to follow the patterns of this world and to just turn on my TV or turn on my phone and hate and judge from the comfort of my own home." The disciples were acting childish. They were bickering amongst themselves over who is the greatest. And I'm sure it's just like when you're driving with children in the back seat, where they are bickering over whatever it might be. And then when you ask them what's going on, they say, "Nothing." Like you didn't just hear the whole conversation. I imagine Jesus is just walking 5 feet in front of them, hearing the entire thing they're talking about. And when he asks them, "What are you talking about?" "Nothing." They are acting childish. Jesus knows what they're talking about. And so he answers their argument for them. And he does it on 2 counts. The first is, he says, "Whoever wants to be first must be last of all and servant of all." That doesn't sound joyful. We're raised to be first, right? What's Ricky Bobby say about being in second? Exactly. Second place is first loser, right? It's just a dumb movie. Don't worry about it if you didn't get it. But this does not sound joyful. And yet we know, because we already heard it today, we know that by following God's will, we will be filled with joy. I know that serving can be a lot of work, but that it also brings a lot of joy. So who volunteered this past Thursday at our first Food for Home packing? I know a number of you all did, right? So I want you to tell me about that evening. Was it fun? It was. There were a lot of smiles there. I think there might have been more smiles there than there have been here, right? There were a lot of smiles there. We had a great time. Did you leave feeling full of joy? Of course we did. We had a good time. We did it quickly, and we left. The fish fries are coming up, right? But I see smiles. That's good, right? The fish fries, we have this opportunity to serve our community, to welcome them in, and to have good fellowship. And we can have so much fun doing that. And on the nights where we have fun, it goes really fast, doesn't it? When we find our joy in service. And so Jesus is telling us right here, you want to be the greatest? You have to be the last. You have to serve with the last. alongside the last. And you will find joy. Now, the second way Jesus answers the question of who's the greatest is by taking a child, which is really weird in this text because this child appears out of nowhere. It's like a magic trick. And he places his child before them and says, "Whoever welcomes one such child in my name welcomes me." Scott Hosey writes about this illustration. He says, quote, "It is surprising and ironic that in a power struggle, when the disciples are behaving like children, Jesus unmasks their aspiration to power by putting a real child in their midst and using him as an object lesson." You're going to act childish? We're going to talk about a child. And it's a great lesson still today for us. As we asked, where do you find happiness? And people said children and grandchildren, right? Children are the source of great joy. And yet we have to stop and ask ourselves, how do we receive children in our lives? Do we serve them? Do we serve with them? Or do we tolerate them? The child in this text is more than just a child for this illustration. Child represents the least. It's someone who is seen without value in that society, somebody who consumes but doesn't contribute. The child mortality rates were extremely high. Jesus embracing the child is a sign to the disciples that they too must embrace those who are perceived as powerless. That we must embrace those who are perceived as powerless. Another pastor and theologian, Micah Keel, writes, "Saying that the way to gain honor is to receive those who are without honor goes against the logic of the ancient society. The kingdom of God assesses and assigns value differently than the human realm. God will receive those who receive the child. This will give access to true power, the power of the one who sent Jesus." God will receive those who receive the child. God will receive those who receive the marginalized. God will receive those who serve the least. God will receive those who welcome the stranger, who feed the hungry, who clothe the naked. This is God's will. This is the law of the Lord, and therefore we will find joy in service to the children, to the marginalized, to the least. As we follow Christ, we have to ask ourselves this question of how do we receive the child? He's placed him before us. The Pulpit Fiction podcast poses the question this way. They ask it in several steps. First, they ask us, how can we receive the children? How are we equipped to receive? And then they make it a bit more personal and they ask, what does it mean to receive children in our churches? Last year was a really rough year for kids in our community. The suicide rate was astronomical. It was deemed as something that needed to have outside help with. And the question becomes, well, how is our community receiving children? And then how are our churches receiving them? Is the church failing in showing kids that they have value, in celebrating that value in children? So what does it mean to receive children in our churches? Is it just a children's moment? And that's good enough? Have you ever heard of something called a playground? We got to experience them in Colorado at the Y Camp in the Rockies. And it's actually a space in the sanctuary that allows children to play during service. And play in ways that are constructive to even possibly being beneficial to the service itself. And they're not stuffed in the back, they're up front. So the children are welcomed and a part of the worship time. Then they ask, how does the congregation respond to kids? And then on a bigger scale, what does it mean to receive children in our communities or schools? And then a question that's probably even harder for us to answer, they ask us, what weight do Jesus' words have as we look at the refugee crisis in Syria, the families at the border, or children hungry in the school down the block. Jesus places this child in front of us and says, everyone who welcomes him welcomes me. So we hear again in that first psalm, happy are those who do not follow the advice of the wicked, or take the path that the sinners tread, or sit in the seat of scoffers, but their delight is in the law of the Lord, and on his law they meditate day and night. Happy are those whose delight is in the law of the Lord. And the law is given to us quite clearly when Jesus says, whoever welcomes one such child in my name welcomes me, and whoever welcomes me welcomes not me, but the one who sent me. And so we can find joy in service. We can find joy in the disaster buckets that we assembled, in the hygiene kits, in the school kits that we made and sent off to church world service throughout the world. We can find joy in Matt 11:28 as we give free beds and linens to people coming out of homelessness and children who are fleeing domestic violence. We can find joy in packing bags and delivering them to the children who are hungry in our community. And we can find joy in giving of our time and our money and our efforts into making sure that these ministries continue to flourish so that our community might recognize the value of children and the value of those that are deemed the least. So let us find our joy in service to the children. Let us find our joy in service to one another. Let us find our joy in service to our community. Let us find our joy in service to Christ. Amen.